There's a story from the mythology of the Western Apache Indians. The keeper of fire was this particular squirrel called Abert squirrel that only lives in Ponderosa pine forests. The Ponderosa pine forests are one of the best known fire-adapted forests in the world. And so Coyote, the trickster, tricks the squirrel into coming down and building a bonfire for a dance. And he dips his tail into the fire to steal fire. Tail catches on fire, starts to run away because, of course, Coyote is not supposed to have fire, but passes it off to humans, to Apaches. And like the Coyote, they're setting fire to the understory as they go. It's this really deep understanding of where fire comes from in terms of where it's really common and how it works in those systems, and how knowledge of it was claimed by Apaches.
And I love that they pass it down in a story because that's easier for people to remember.
We lack cultural symbols or cultural myths, right, to help us understand and legitimize particular fire practices other than Smokey Bear, Bambi, right, and the 20th century view of all fires is bad and fire suppression is the ultimate goal.
What was his phrase? Only you can prevent forest fires, but it was don't smoke in the forest?
No, so Smokey Bear was it's kind of a complicated history. But Smokey Bear was a symbol for the natural world telling humans that it's on us to prevent this fire problem. For us, the duality of humans and nature, treating them as separate, is actually kind of unusual, right? Cross-culturally, that kind of duality is a very small minority. His message has kind of changed a little bit now, where you can stop unwanted forest fires. Right?
Oh, when did they change that?
Very, very recently. Very, very recently.
Interesting. Okay, so they are getting a sense that some fires are good. Some fires regenerate the landscape, and maybe our storytelling should shape that.
I'm an environmental archaeologist, which in a nutshell just means that I study how past societies interacted with their environments, lived with them, how they impacted them, and for us today, what kind of lessons we can learn from the successful and unsuccessful interactions with past environments. One of my biggest projects is in northern New Mexico, working on a landscape that was inhabited by the ancestors of people who live at the Pueblo of Jemez. This landscape was covered in pine forests. They lived in these forests that are extremely fire-prone, comfortably for centuries. Forests that we're really struggling with today. The type of fire that's happening now is basically historically unprecedented.
And now we have what they're terming megafires?
Yes, yeah. Megafires is kind of a fuzzy term in that it might mean something different to different people or in different contexts.
I see a big, fat fire.
Yes, that's the one thing that communicates really well, a big, fat fire. In the 1970s, when we were first starting to see the kind of uptick in fires in the western U.S. again, a 10,000-acre fire seemed like a huge fire. Now, a 10,000-acre fire doesn't even get on the news. And no one hears about 10,000-acre fires. It's only the 100,000-acre fires that use. And then the state of Arizona, where I lived for some time, in 2011, the record for the largest fire was broken not once but twice in the same fire season, more than 500,000 acres each.
Oh my God.
Our big question is, how did people live for centuries in these forests and not have these problems? There was a combination of using wood as a resource, and using fire as a tool that helped to kind of create a buffer for these folks to live in these fire-prone forests.
So the native peoples were creating these buffer zones, and then were they also doing other things?
It looks like around the human communities, we see something that is modern fire-wise advocacy. There are very few living trees around these pueblos, and there's probably very little fuel of any kind. Any young trees that were to grow up would probably be harvested and burnt in people's fireplaces. It's a lot easier to harvest small trees with a stone axe than it is a big mature tree.
Right.
And so there are no trees within at least maybe a couple football fields, maybe 3 or 4 football fields around these towns.
You know, in every city I've ever lived in, the wealthier people want to be up in the hillsides, in the mountainsides, which are surrounded by trees. From an environmentalist perspective, you get more shade from the trees, keeps your house cooler, You feel more in nature when you do that, as opposed to like a New York City, Manhattan style lifestyle.
Right. The lesson partly from this is that there are risks involved, right? And having those fuels right up around your house, not just for you, but for others in your community. We spend a lot of time talking to Native peoples today. And there's a great respect for fire, kind of uniformly, a great respect for the power of fire. Mm-hmm. But it's incredibly useful as a tool as well. Now that we have lots of evidence for lots and lots of little fires in a patchwork mosaic, that means that a fire can't spread the way it would normally, because it'll run into something that's already burned up the fuel, so then it runs out of fuel to spread.
The bigger trees are probably more able to withstand fires than smaller ones anyway, so the fire would clear out the brush underneath, but the big ones would remain standing, and then they could propagate new generations.
That's exactly right. Old growth are better equipped to survive these lots of cooler, smaller fires.
And do you think were they intentionally setting fires to help clear out that underbrush?
In some circumstances, yeah, to burn certain patches of shrubs where the shrubs actually resprout, are really great for basketry. They might burn another patch to freshen up the grass to attract deer to it in the next growing season.
All of that implies a really deep understanding and observation of that area.
Absolutely. We as certainly here in the U.S., as Americans, have been in the West for a relatively short period of time, whereas the people who have lived here for millennia, the American Indian communities, have really deep understanding of the way these environments work, right? Mm-hmm. The way certain processes work in those environments, like fire.
With climate change, every tree counts, kind of like every vote. It feels like every tree really counts. So what do you think is the balance here?
You're absolutely right. The old growth trees are the source for carbon sequestration. Taking out old trees is not the issue, or shouldn't be the issue. It's taking out the small trees. In order to make it marketable or economically feasible for a logging company to go out and take the small diameter trees, usually they have to dangle the carrot of large diameter trees too.
Right.
What we see from, say, the Ancestral Jemez landscape is that the best way to deal with those small diameter trees is have lots and lots and lots of people using them on a regular basis. There's nothing wrong with thinning those trees, mm-hmm. and creating a landscape that's really resilient to droughts and extreme fire weather. Getting rid of the small diameter trees to remove the risk for catastrophic fires that would kill all the trees is basically the best carbon impact.
Right, but leaving some small trees obviously to grow into bigger trees.
Right, and having folks who have a vested interest in those landscapes. Mm-hmm. Their ancestors lived on those landscapes.
Do you refer to your work as informative or predictive? Do you feel a little bit like a Cassandra who is telling everyone that Troy is going to burn and nobody's listening? Or do you feel like there is a support for
That's a really good question.
your study?
My team and related folks are taking every opportunity we can to kind of share what we've learned and what we think is important to take away from our work to as many audiences as possible. Even if the everyday citizen living in the hills of Southern California may not feel empowered on their own, they might one day find themselves at a listening session with their congressperson. Mm-hmm. We talk to managers as much as we can in the Forest Service or the Park Service. There's often a false dichotomy because people don't understand fire very well between there will be fire or we can have a world without fire. It's more a question of what kind of fire we want to live with. Mm-hmm. What kind of ecological consequences of fire are we willing to live with? What are we willing to do to change our behavior